So my name's Ken, and I'm a drug addict. And it's good to be here. Thanks for calling. I was here a few months ago, and that list went around, and I put my name on it, and someone called me, and here I am. And it's just that easy. If you can do that, you can stay clean and suffer. So I am a drug addict, and I will say that that's the end of the facts. Everything else I have to say is just my opinion or my observation. It's not necessarily the way it is or how it works or relevant to you or anybody. It's just what I've done and said and do. And on October 6th, I celebrated 28 years of continuous sobriety. Thanks, and that's ridiculous. Really, it really is ridiculous. And I do want to say that I've been to a lot of meetings. AA, NA, and other 12-step groups are my primary source of recovery. I don't seek elsewhere for my recovery. I come here for that. And I've heard a lot of people say a lot of things. And I gotta say, my least favorite people to listen to are the old timers. They really are. I really don't get that concerned about how hard it is for someone to find some place to park their RV in the resort, and and all that stuff you get from people with a whole lot of clean time. I'd much rather hear someone come in here and say, I've got 30 days and I don't know how to stay clean, and here's what I'm going through. That's what I like to hear. And I think a lot of people with a lot of time lose that edge of what it's like to stay clean. They get lost in their luxury problems, and hopefully if you've got many years of sobriety, you have luxury problems. I know I do, but I don't think it really helps the newcomer out. And what does help the newcomer out is the basic facts of what we are, and we are in a nutshell. What this is, what we are right here. We're one addict helping another to recover from drug addiction. That's it. Who you are, what you look like, where you work, what you drive, what you wear isn't really even relevant. It really isn't. It's what do you do for your recovery? What can you do to help me? What can I do to help you? And how can we do this together and get somewhere where we don't have to use drugs, because we came here to learn how to not do that. And my drug history, I have to say my first drug of choice was attention. It's a drug, believe me. You get a high out of it. And I set before you, having done things that I look back on that appall me just for attention, just to be noticed, and it's always been important for me to be noticed and to be the loudest or the most obnoxious person in the room. You don't have to like me, but notice me, that type of thing. And I sometimes I keep that under control, and sometimes I don't. I'm not very astute often. That was my first drug of choice, was attention, and it's nothing I've worked the steps on. I haven't worked my steps on that, and maybe I should think about it. And and it doesn't really go away with sobriety or age. I still act out, and I'll appall a lot of people in meetings. I get yelled at in meetings by people with less time than me. To shut up or sit down or leave the kids alone or be quiet or put that away, that type of thing. So, I'm there. And I know that my next drug of choice was sugar. And as a little kid, I was addicted to that sugar, and on Halloween night, I would take all the candy that I got and dump it out and just start eating it, and I would gorge myself, and I would have piles of half-eaten candy because what was there was better than what I had in my mouth, and I couldn't wait to finish this to start this, and that's addiction. That's a good sign your kid is an addict if he's doing that. And on the other hand, my sister would take all of her candy, alphabetize it, color arrange it, set it up for here to last till the next Halloween or the next candy holiday, and and my job was to talk her out of it, and so that whole addiction thing hit me with sugar, and it hit me with the attention, and then and then as a teenager in the 70s. We would watch films in health class, and they would often, the government made don't use drug films, and it was often, these people in a basement with like the light pounding and the music pounding, and people laying on the floor and twirling, and they would show us those films, and I wanted that. That's what I wanted that. I didn't realize it was a warning. I thought it was like, yeah, bring it on, and I got there. I can remember one of the first times I used, I was in the attic of friends, and we were listening to Pink Floyd on the Gumma, and a black light was on, and a strobe light was on, and we were smoking pot, and there was someone sleeping on the floor, and I'm like, this is it. Still waiting for the flashbacks the government promised me. Never did get those. The government promised flashbacks. When I was a teenager, I was awkward, and I was stuck with if only, all those if onlys, and I wasn't happy, and I didn't have a great family life, and I didn't know how to act in public or look in public or dress in public, and I can remember in grade school I sat next to the future state representative on one side of me, and this future published artist on the other side, and I would look at their work and I'd look at my work, and I would just shove it under the desk, and there was never anything for me on PTA night, nothing ever, and I never added up, and I remember the teachers and instructors talking to my parents, and they'd say, Ken has so much potential if he would just apply himself, and I didn't know how to apply myself. But when I started drinking and using drugs, I met my potential. That I knew right away that this was gonna be my thing, and it was. The first time I drank alcohol, I remember. Most people don't remember their first drug. I do. It was like taking a bite out of a thunderbolt. That warmth went down and just came back up, and I met my potential, and my drug use started with I got a job loading boxcars all night. It's like, how am I going to do that? And I thought, well, I could use drugs. Never used drugs before. I could use drugs, and I did. I got some. At the time, cross tops were available and cheap and real, and that's what worked. So my introduction was drugs, was casual, and it just instantly, I was an instant drug addict. It was instantly, my life and thinking was revolved around the using and finding ways and means to get more and getting and all of that stuff, and I had no desire to stop, and I remember the first time I ever smoked pot, I caught my sister candy lady with a bag, her and her friend with a bag of pot, and she's like, "Oh God, don't tell." And I said, "Well, give me some," and and she gave me some, and I'm like, "Well, how do you do it?" And she gave me some papers, and so I ran to the school and underneath the baseball bleachers, and I rolled this joint, and it's like, oh shit, and I ran back home, I need some matches, got the matches, and ran back and smoked this joint for the first time, and instantly wanted more, and so, of course, my drug use went to speed and crank and cocaine and downers and quaaludes and basically whatever I could get. My drug of choice was based on availability, and I just loved it. I wore the T-shirts. I had the T-shirts and the clothes and the friends and I just loved using. And I've heard a lot of stories in these rooms, and I don't have a fabulous drunk and drug-a-log. I never ever woke up in Madagascar or stole the tugboat. I never did any of those fabulous things you hear people talking about. I just did a series of sleazy, tacky, swarmy things with the hopes that tomorrow would be better, and it never, ever was. Tomorrow was never better, and so. Long story short, I wound up with a swollen liver, a whole bunch of tickets and fines and drug, alcohol or drunken driving tickets, and I worked for the Department of Transportation, and I drove a dump truck, and you can't drive a dump truck if you don't have a driver's license, so I got fired from my job, and I came in and said, well, I can't drive. They took my license, and they said, well, you can't work here, go. And I went, and so I had about a month in between getting that ticket and getting fired, and I knew that I'd been told that they were looking for me because I had a union, and you can't just fire someone. There's a process, and so they were wanting me to come back and talk to them, and I was avoiding them. And I was in a tavern in Corvallis, Squirrel's Tavern, and I was upstairs, and the bartender came up and said there was a guy with a suit looking for me, and so I said, send him up. And it was my boss's boss, and he said, man, we are in bad trouble. You need to come into work, and we need to get you on the payroll, and we need to talk to you, and we need you to fix all this. And my plans was to go get I'd been there for 5 years, and I had this little nest egg of retirement. And I was going to get that out and go as far deep into Mexico as I could get and drink tequila until I was dead. That's how I chose to live. And that didn't happen. I went back in, and there was a group of people, and it was an intervention, and it was, what are you going to do? What are you going to do about your drinking? Of course, I didn't say, well, I'm addicted to cocaine, and I didn't tell them all that. I stole pot from the police evidence room. I didn't tell them that. And, there's a lot of stuff they didn't know. But they knew I had a drunk driving ticket. And they said, what are you going to do about your drinking? And I was like, well, I'm the kind of alcoholic that only drinks on weekends. And they were like, well, that was a Thursday night that you got arrested, and I didn't know what to say. So they're like, what are you going to do about your drinking? And I said, well, I suppose I probably should go to a treatment center. And for a long time, I lived in this fear of I knew that my life was unmanageable, that I was powerless over drugs and alcohol years before I knew it was a step towards recovery. I lived in this fear that someday I'm going to have to quit using, and I didn't know how that was going to happen. I envisioned death, imprisonment, or an asylum. I thought that's what it's going to take to get me to quit drinking and using, and I knew someday that was going to happen. And at some point right in there, the fear of getting sober was less than the fear of staying loaded. I got to that point where I didn't know how to live the way I was living, and I was miserable, and one of the last night I drank before I got that ticket, I was drinking this quart of beer, and my life had gotten to where I would go to work, I'd get off work, and I'd buy 3 or 4 quarts of beer, whatever it was I could afford, and I would drink it, and I'd pass out, and I'd wake up wet from my belt buckle to my knees, and I'd take a shower and go to work and do it again the next day. And that was my life. That's what I'd got to. And I was sitting in there, and I was drinking this quart of beer, and I started crying, and I threw this quart of beer against this brick wall, kind of like this, and it busted, and I screamed out that I was tired of living and I wanted to die. And the next day I got that ticket, which led me to treatment. So I'm in this room in this intervention, and they're like, well, what are you going to do about your drinking? And I told them, well, I suppose I could go to treatment. And they said, well, what do you have in mind? I hadn't thought about it at all. The only thing I knew is I'd read an article that Johnny Cash was in the Betty Ford Center. So I told him, well, I think what I need to do is go to treatment. I think I need to go to the Betty Ford Center, And I need to talk to that man. Seriously, I do. And they just looked at each other and said, where's the Betty Ford Center? And I said, I have no idea. I don't know. I have no idea. How far could it be? Isn't it worth it? To get me? And so they left the room and came back and said, it's in California somewhere, and they said, what else do you got? What else do you got? And I remember seeing the commercials for Serenity Lane. If you or a loved one has a drinking problem, And I thought for sure my mother was going to see that and call them. But so I wound up in Serenity Lane, and it was a Friday night. I had a week's notice before I went, and I got my week drunk in, and I say drunk, but that included cocaine and marijuana and whatever else I could get. And that Friday night, Friday morning, I went down, and this guy gave me a ride to the treatment center, and it was like the head safety officer for the state, and he was just like this big square suited guy with a comb over, and he was like, well, this is your, which way do you want to go? You just, however you want to get there, you just tell me, we'll get there. And I said, I'm really hungry. And he said, well, let's stop and get something to eat. So we stopped at a deli in Junction City. And I ordered a sandwich and a St. Pauli girl. Now, the night before, I'd been drinking B-52s all night long. And it was about 3 in the morning, and I was at this after-hours party, and I was drinking a Heidelberg, and I drank that Heidelberg, and I looked at it and said, this is the last beer I'm ever going to drink. And I set it down, and the next day it was like, I don't want my last beer to be a Heidelberg. I really don't. And so I ordered this St. Pauli girl, and this guy was like, what are you doing? And I said, I'm having a beer with my sandwich. Don't you understand what we're doing here? And it's like, I understand, we're taking me to treatment, I'm quitting drinking, and I am not there yet, and I'm going to drink this beer. And this guy was just like, oh no, you're not. And he went across the table and grabbed it, and I didn't let go of it. We did this, for a while, and I finally just said, I'm done. And I let go of it, and he fell backwards, and his comb over was, down here. And we got in the car and drove off, food uneaten, beer undrank, and, I look back, I can still remember the look on this lady's face behind the counter, like, wondering what just happened there. And so I checked into a treatment center, Serenity Lane, and I got 30 days of sobriety. And voted most likely to relapse. And I can remember I remember saying, I want to go to the Jesco Club, because they'd take us out to meetings and they'd go, you will get your ass kicked at the Jesco Club. I didn't know, you guys don't look so bad. But they told me I would not fit in here. And they took me to other meetings around town. But I spent the first couple of years of sobriety on that fence wondering, do I want to use, do I not want to use, this clean and sober kin isn't really, I really wasn't into it that much. And I was on that fence, and I hung on to my friends, and I would go to the bars, and I started noticing that the people in the rooms were saying things like, we love you, Ken. We hope you stick with us. And the people in the bars were saying things like, you're no fun anymore. and so at 2 years of sobriety, I pushed my luck just a little bit more than I should have, and I got arrested. And one of my reasons for getting clean and sober was to never have to get arrested again. And I found myself in a drunk tank in the Benton County Jail, stone cold sober. And I do want to tell you that the drunk tank loses a lot of its appeal when you're sober. It's just not that pretty. And and I was in that drunk tank going, my God, how did I get here? I knew how I got there. I knew what I had done. But it's like, I'm clean and sober. I should not be arrested. And so I got out of that jail, and I came into meetings, and I talked about having been arrested. And people had been telling me over and over and over again, Ken, you got to work the steps. You got to work the steps. And I knew my life was unmanageable, and I was powerless over drugs. I knew that years before I knew it was a way to get a step towards recovery. I knew that. But the second and third step I was not interested in any way. I was not interested in God in any way, shape, or form. And honestly, I thought the steps on the wall were decorations, not instructions. And they're not particularly great decorations, Really, they're just a bunch of words. So a friend of mine that I knew in the meetings came up to me one day and said, if you want to stick around here and you want to achieve something in here, you need to work the steps. And I said, okay, how do I do it? I don't want to get arrested again. How do I do it? So he told me, you need to get on your knees every morning and turn your will and your life over to God. And then at the end of the day, you need to get on your knees and thank God for keeping you clean and sober for another day. Just do that for a while. And so I started doing that. And another thing that guy did was he took me aside one time at a meeting, and he grabbed my shirt like this and had me up against the wall, and he said, you have a bad attitude. And I was ready to get hit, because every time anyone had their shirt, and I was against the wall, I always got hit, every time. And he's like, you have a bad attitude. And I said, yeah, well, what of it? And he goes, well, how about this? How about if, think about this. If you change your actions, your attitude will change. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, try saying please, thank you, and I appreciate it, just once in a while. And so I said, okay, I'll do that. And I did. I started saying please, thank you, and I appreciate it. And it wasn't long after that I started noticing that I was feeling pleased, thankful, and appreciative. Imagine that. I was feeling, Frank, guess what? I did it and it worked. And he said, yeah. So he was the one that told me to start praying. So I started praying, and I had this little Sheltie dog, and I'd had it for years, and I would go home, I'd get up, and I'd close the bathroom door, and I'd lock it, and I'd drop to my knees and say, God, keep me clean and sober today, and I'd, open the door and walk out, and I'd do the same thing at night, and I was thinking about that, and I thought, I don't want that dog I didn't want my dog to see me praying. That's how hung up I was about it. I never locked the door when I puked. I never closed the door when I puked. But So that was my introduction, and once I got onto the second and the third step, it just opened the doors for step work. I couldn't wait to do more, and I wrote out a fourth step, and I took a week off of work to do a fourth step, and I was at home, and I was sitting down with, this was before we had step working guides, and I'd start writing, and then I would find myself at the refrigerator going, what am I looking for? and so I knew that I wasn't able to be in my house and do this, without being distracted. So I went I rented a hotel for a week in Junction City, and it was just this shitty hotel, and it was like, one of the hotel that was just hotel, didn't even have a name, just hotel on Refinery Row or whatever, and so I checked into there, and I started writing, and I was without distraction, and I was able to get all this stuff down, and when I was done, I called my sponsor and I said, I'm done with my fifth step. And he said, I'm done with my fourth step. He said, I'll be right over. It's time to do the fifth step. And I said, give me some breathing room here. And he's like, I said, I'm not home. And he said, well, where are you? And I said, I'm in Junction City. And he goes, I'll meet you in Monroe. And we met in Monroe, and he made me do that fifth step. And if anyone's ever done a fourth and a fifth step, you know what a relief that is. What a relief it is to just let go of all that and to be free from all that. And of course, by doing that, you unearth a whole bunch of character defects and shortcomings, and you get to work through those too. And sixth and the seventh step, then you get to do amends and all of that good stuff. At one point in time in my recovery, something that's really important is I decided it was necessary for me to contact my parents and sit down across the table from them and to give them hell and to let them know that it's their fault that I wound up the way I was, and I seriously blame them, and I would blame anybody for my addiction. I was ready to blame anybody, and if only my parents would have came to my Little League games, I wouldn't have had to use. If only they would have bought me that pony, I would have fed it. I would have fed it. Damn it, I would have fed it. If only. And the bottom line is, my dad never set me down to suggest I combine Seconal and Scotch. I did that on my own. My mom never set me down to suggest I take LSD for headaches. I came up with that. That was mine. I came up with that one, And so, who am I to blame anyone for that, for anything? And I was sitting across the table in a restaurant at my parents', and I was looking at them, and I didn't have the heart. I had this compassion, this overwhelming compassion for them, knowing that they did what they did, and they did the best they could with what they had to work with, and all of that. And I just looked at them and I said, there was a lot of hard times, and it wasn't easy, and I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive yourself. And my dad started crying right there, and he's like, I don't think I can. I said, well, I hope you can, and I hope you believe me that you're forgiven. And that was so much more beneficial than going, you didn't buy me that pony, you never came to my Little League games, the year that, the 23rd of December, there was nothing but a trail of flock out through the back door, and the tree in the backyard, because Christmas wasn't going well that year. That's what made I remembered that so many times when I was using them bastards. How do you deprive a kid for Christmas? 2 days before, and so. That's some of the benefits for sobriety is you get to forgive the people that think we're unforgivable and see them in a new light. Just a week ago last Wednesday, I got a call, and I work 11-hour days, and I'd worked with an hour lunch break, but I'd worked all day, and I came home, and it was a Thursday night, and I was tired, and I was going to go to a meeting, and I thought, yeah, no, I'm going to watch. There's a new South Park and Office and Parks and Rec on tonight. I'm going to watch TV. So I'm walking to the Mexican restaurant to get a chili relleno or something like that, and my phone rings, and caller ID is my mom, and I get this, Kenneth, it's your mother. And I say, I know, I know. And she's, you need to go to Albany and go into her sock drawer and get her passports and bring it to the Portland airport. And I'm like, no, I don't. She said, well, I need you to do that. I need you to do that. And it's like, what the hell? Portland, really? And I said, how much time do I have to do this? And she's like, she asked the guy, and he's like, you have until 10:30, and I'm 6 o'clock. What are you doing at the airport 4.5 hours early? And she's like, just do it. And I thought, okay. And and I was pissed. I went and got their sock drawer open and found their passports and took it. And the whole way I'm thinking, you bastards! How dare you deprive me of The Office and the South Park, new episode of South Park. And and I got there, and the look of relief on their face made all that resentment go away. And I realized I was the only thing that was standing between them and going on the cruise that they've been waiting all year to go. And I was able to do it. And just the fact that I was able to help them instead of just hurt them one more time. And that this doesn't really have anything to do with it, but the sweet part is my daddy's pretty old, and he said, I want you to know how appreciative I am for this. And I said, I can see that. He pulls his wallet out and gives me $5. Which is, how beautiful is that? I wouldn't have taken it if it was any more, but it was like, I don't know what the thought. But anyways, while I was on my way to Portland, someone had put on Facebook, does anybody have a fairy costume between size 6 and 7 for a girl who's poor and wants to be a fairy for Halloween? And, and I replied back, I could probably help you out. And she was like, you have a fairy costume? And I said, well, no, I don't, but I got some money. And so she's like, this is like the day before, and she's like, are you going to be in Portland anytime soon? I said, no, but I can mail it. And, the next day I'm like, I'm on my way to Portland. And I said, can you meet me at the airport? And she's like, well, no. And I'm like, okay. And so, I said, I'll get your address when I'm there. I'll come over. And she gave me the address. And it was like a half hour the opposite direction. And, and I had to work the next morning. And I didn't want to do it. But I did it. And I went over and I gave this lady $40. And the next day I got this picture of this little girl in a pirate outfit. It wasn't a fairy outfit. And it was just like, thank God I was able to help out a kid. She said, you don't even know how much this little girl appreciated that. And that's a gift of sobriety for me. That is a gift of sobriety. Something else about that, I want to say a couple other things. One thing is, I'm going to get back to that little girl, is there was a point in time in my sobriety where I realized, where everything was going good for me. And I realized how fortunate I was to be who I am. And I remembered that night that I was crying up through that beer against the wall and screaming that I was tired of living and wanted to die. And I thought, you know what? There's very little of that person left alive in me today. There's not, just the vessel is about it. My mind is different. My thought processes, everything is different. And I realized that's how God answers prayers. When I asked to die, I never would have expected it would be and reborn to someone I wanted to be. You know, I never would have dreamed that. And you know, that's the beauty of working the steps. We get to transform and rebuild our lives into something we want. And you know, that was one of my I've had a few burning bush spiritual awakenings, and that was one of them, having that realization. And I know that in my life I've had more farewells than the Queen Mary. You know, I've been told I don't want you no more so many times. You know, and you know, it's like I know that my life is like a tide pool, and sometimes it's full of beautiful stuff, and sometimes it's just empty. But it always ebbs and flows, and I always have beauty in my life, and I've been blessed with the ability, no matter how I feel or where I'm at or what I'm doing, to look around me and realize that and find something that amazes me. I have that ability. No matter, I could be depressed, I could be hungry, I could be lonely, angry, tired, miserable, but I can always find something that amazes me, and I do that often. And so I've had, you know, I was told in early sobriety you're going to have the highest highs and the lowest lows, and I've had some highs and I've had some lows, and thank God I'm able to enjoy the good times and cry through the hard times, and 5 more minutes, 3 more, 3 more minutes. So in closing, I want to say that good times and bad times. Last summer at an NA camp out at Moonshine Camp, I had met this woman and her 2 little kids. She had 3 kids, a baby, a boy, and a 6-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl. And those kids just instantly touched my heart. This little boy came up to me and he climbed on my lap, and he sat for a couple hours talking to me. A lot of it I couldn't understand because he was really tired, but he just touched my heart so deeply. And his sister was just beautiful, and she touched my heart, and I just fell in love with these kids instantly. And he told me all kinds of things, and he asked if I had a job and if I could take them to the zoo, and because their dad was in jail, and I said, yeah, I have a job and I can take you to the zoo, and did. And I took these kids to the zoo, and I made arrangements to buy their school supplies for them, take them each out and buy their school supplies, and on August 6th, I got a text from their mother saying, we're camping in Brownsville and the kids want you to come have hamburgers with us. And I said, I'll come do that. And the next text I got was that Ryan had drowned. The little 6-year-old boy had drowned. And he was revived, and he's in Dornbecker's Hospital in Eugene, in Portland. And my heart just sunk. And about 6 days later, I got a text from her saying, you should come say goodbye to Ryan, and I did, and I held this little boy, and I just thought how sad it's going to be that the world doesn't get to meet this kid. And I kissed him goodbye, and he died shortly after I left, and I didn't get to take him out to buy school supplies, and I did his sister. And that day that I went there and said goodbye to him, I took his 8-year-old sister out shopping for school clothes, and we went to OMSI, and this little 8-year-old girl was just this beautiful, delightful kid who I just loved being around. And she explained to me so much about acceptance and about death and about heaven, and all stuff I don't necessarily believe, but hope I'm wrong and hope she's right. And I learned so much about acceptance, and from that came me about a month, 2 months, crying every day, thinking about Ryan and him drowning, and the fact that I met him and he came into my life for a couple short months, and I have hundreds of pictures of him and I and him and when I was in Portland, and that little girl, the lady that was looking for the Halloween costume, was friends with the mother and this kid, and the mother was in drug court, and she is not clean and sober, and is having a hard time, and it's a sad thing, it's a sad thing that this happened to this lady, and she lost what little sobriety she had, and things aren't looking good. But when I was in Portland and gave that $40 for that Halloween costume to a girl, that girl knew Ryan very well, and I got to sit down and talk to someone, because I've never got to talk to the mother really, about that kid, and let go of a lot of that stuff, and get a lot of stuff brought back to me, about what I believed about him, because I didn't know him that well, and he was a sweet, sweet kid, and I ran into the paramedics that saved his life that day, talked to them, so, the whole God thing with my mother calling me and me not, I didn't want to go to Portland. But by the end of that night, I had sit down and cried with someone over the death of a 6-year-old boy. That's the gifts that I get from being clean and sober. I wouldn't have gave a damn if I was using. I would not have cared about any of that. I wouldn't have met him. I wouldn't have known him. I probably really wouldn't even be alive today. So my time's up, and I appreciate everyone listening to me, and thank you for having me come here. And I guess if I could say anything in closing, it would be if you want to stay clean and sober, you're in the right place. And if you want to work the steps, there's a lot of people here that'll help you work them. And it's the only thing that saved my life, and it's probably the only thing that's going to save yours too. So thanks. That's all.